All right, so it's 3 o'clock now. Um, all right, thank you so much for joining the second GeoTraceS seminar. So I'm the moderator of today's seminar. My name is Tian. I'm a research fellow in the Constructor University in Germany. So before we start, I'll just give you a brief introduction of the seminar format, and then we can move on to the speakers. So this GeoTraces seminar is initiated and organized by GeoTraces Early Career Sciences Committee. And then we do this every month from April to November with a break in July. And we will also have a Christmas bonus seminar. And the time is usually 9 a.m. or 3 p.m. And we try to cover as many time zones as possible. And the seminar format is that we will have two talks, and each talk is 20 minutes, and by the one senior speakers and then one ECS speakers. And in the end, we will have 15 minutes Q&A session. And if you have questions, please raise your hand or just write your question in the chat. And the seminar will be recorded and uploaded to the GeoTraces YouTube channel. So today we are very happy to have two speakers. The first one will be Professor John Hawkins from University of Pennsylvania. And he's an expert in about the chemical cycling of trace metal in cryosphere, particularly on the glacial meltwater season through mostly field observation, which provide very valuable data. And his research has contributed tremendously to the polar trace metal research community. So he was one of the first people I thought of when we first set the topic of this seminar. And the second speaker is Professor Laramie Jensen. She's a highly experienced seagull and marine scientist and has done a lot of amazing work in the Arctic Ocean, combining geotraces observation with study of Arctic circulation, sea ice process, to understand how climate change affect marine chemistry. And just right before we start, I also want to give you a heads up that the next seminar will be held at 30th June, and the topic will be the atmospheric aerosol deposition in the global ocean. And the speakers that we have invited is Professor Clifton Buck and Prima Piyusha Panda. Excuse my pronunciation. All right, so I will start sharing, and then the floor is yours, John.
Thanks, Stanley. Okay, let's try and get this to work. Does that look okay? Perfect.
Yeah, it's all good.
Okay, let me find my mouse. Okay, so thank you, Stanley and Xiaoling, for inviting me to talk here, this GeoTraceS seminar. I feel a little bit like an imposter because, as Stanley might have alluded to a little bit, I'm not in geotraces and I'm not an oceanographer. I'm more focused on kind of land processes. I'm very interested in these land-ocean connections. So I hope this is of interest to you all, and thinking about glaciers, particularly in polar regions, as a source of trace metals or potential source of trace metals to the ocean. I'll get back to that satellite image on my first slide in a bit. I have to admit, I pinched this slide from Kate Hendry because I really like the way that she introduced one of her presentations. But this is just to remind us all why we're here and why we're talking about polar environments in particular. So this is temperature anomaly compared to the 1951 to 1980 average. And as we get through to the 90s and noughties, as I'm sure you all know, we'll start to see the polar regions get much more red or warmer in color. They are warming more rapidly than our global average. The Arctic is warming 3 to 4 times more rapidly than the global average. And all this, although this is like a pretty excuse to start talking about global warming and carbon dioxide emissions and fossil fuel emissions in general, it's also, I think, a good reminder of why we're interested in the polar regions and why we're interested in the cryosphere in particular, because it does respond quite rapidly to changes in temperature. And probably, I would argue anyway, of all the Earth systems, the cryosphere is probably the most vulnerable to warming. So when we think about major coastal inputs of metals to the Arctic, and Laramie is probably going to chat about some of these as well. We think about rivers, we think about the great Arctic rivers and some of the smaller rivers in the Arctic. We might think about alien dust or aerosols, and this is a satellite image of Alaska. We might also think about glacial meltwater, which is what I'm going to talk mainly about, or icebergs. I'm not going to talk so much about icebergs, but they're obviously also connected to glacial processes. And then we might think about shelf sediments. So my focus today is really going to be on the glacial meltwater end member here, thinking about how big might these inputs be, how they might be changing in a warming world. And I think about glacial environments as well as being these, fundamentally different environments to what you would expect from other terrestrial systems. When you build a glacier over a parcel of land, over a catchment, it really changes the processes that are going on. As you can imagine, it gets colder. There's ice. There's very little sunlight hitting the bottom of the glacier, or no sunlight hitting the bottom of the glacier. Truncated food webs, microbially dominated metabolisms. Lots of physical erosion that I get to. So it's a very different environment to what you might expect of a temperate system or a deglaciated catchment even. And when folks mainly think about the cryosphere or mainly think about glaciers and ice sheets in general, they think from the perspective, I think, mostly of sea level rise. And that's kind of natural. Glaciers or glacial melt has added several centimeters to global sea level rise in the last couple of decades. There's potential for meters of sea level rise in the coming centuries. And I just wanted to show you this slide as well to kind of contextualize the freshwater runoff that's coming from icebergs and runoff from these environments as well. And even though it's only a few percent of global riverine runoff, it is still a few percent of global riverine runoff. Glaciers cover 10% of land surface area in general, mainly in the ice sheets. But that amount of runoff that's coming off of those systems is changing, and it's changing quite rapidly due to warming. And this is one of the reasons why a recent study on global tipping points has highlighted the Greenland ice sheet and the West Antarctic ice sheet as close to tipping due to global warming. And there's only 5 environments that they pointed out here as close to tipping due to global warming. And 2 of those 5 are the ice sheets. So this suggests that their triggering will severely damage our planet's life support systems, threaten the stability of our societies. And again, this is mainly from the perspective of thinking about sea level rise and threats of sea level rise to our coastal communities. But that just, that's, I think, as well as a good reminder of how much fresh water these environments are likely to add to the ocean in the coming century, at least. Okay. I also like to think as well about these environments as highly dynamic, like many of our Earth systems, or many of our environments in the Earth system. This is just a rendering of a model of glacial interglacial Laurentide ice sheet mass loss from the Max Planck Institute for Meteorology. And it's just showing how much ice we can lose in a very small amount of time and what impacts that could have on coastal salinity in particular. But think about what impacts that could have on, biogeochemical cycling in these coastal environments. So it's not just thinking about contemporary environments for me. Anyway, I'm starting to think about, well, what were the impact of like very rapid deglaciation events in the past for particularly coastal biogeochemical cycles, but potentially global biogeochemical cycles because of the amount of fresh water and associated sediment and solute that these guys might flush into the ocean in very short time periods. We now know there's water under ice sheets and glaciers. We've known this for a few decades now. It was a paradigm shift when we started to find water underneath the Antarctic ice sheet in the form of these subglacial lakes. Each one of these dots you can see on the map of Antarctica there is a subglacial lake. The red ones are inactive lakes. The blue ones are active subglacial lakes, meaning that they drain and flush on cycles or semi-cycles. And on the left there, you can see the subglacial environment of Greenland. Everywhere that's red there is lightly thawed, so there's water at the bed of the ice sheet. Everywhere that's blue there is lightly frozen, although there are some locations in that frozen part where folks have drilled to the bed and found that it's wet there as well. So the more we look, it seems, the more we seem to find liquid water under ice. Where there's liquid water, there's usually life, or there's life as far as we know, and there's active biogeochemical cycling. Liquid water is also really great for lubricating the bed of ice and helping it move. And that also helps engage kind of physical erosion, and that's very important for our story of glaciers as well. And there's, over 700 identified subglacial lakes in Antarctica. Folks have also modeled or assumed that there's these river networks under Antarctica linking some of these lakes and flushing subglacial meltwater from tens to maybe hundreds of kilometers inland to the coastal system. And in the Southern Ocean, as I'm sure, as GeoTraces folk, you're all aware, that is an iron-starved environment. Okay, so I'm going to do this quite quickly, but here's my very quick glacial hydrology 101. This is how we are pretty sure they work. This is what happens when you cut, or this is what a cut open catchment of the Greenland ice sheet looks like, a land terminating catchment anyway. In kind of midsummer, it's this complex hydrological system, usually flushing meltwater from the surface to the bed of the ice. So we can generate the very high amounts of surface melt in Greenland, other temperate systems. In Greenland, you get these surface lakes form. These can be several kilometers in diameter, and they can drain very, very quickly as well. They fracture the ice below them, and they can drain in a few hours, some of these very large lakes. We also have moulins and crevasses, and they funnel meltwater from the surface of the ice to the bed of the ice sheet. And then there's some biogeochemical weathering that occurs down the bed of the ice sheet, and there's some wacky environments that we found, things like Blood Falls, for example, as an end member maybe, but also in Greenland, some wacky environments where we know there's a very interesting redox biogeochemistry going on, and reducing conditions that you might assume can mobilize a lot of dissolved iron, for example. And that water flows under the ice in these river networks or stream networks and exits the ice at these things that we call glacial portals, which is basically a subglacial meltwater river emerging from underneath the ice sheet or underneath the glacier. And as you can hopefully see in this picture, that water is quite dark in color, it looks milky in color. That's very different to the water I showed you at the surface, which is very clear and pristine. And that's because of all this eroded material at the bottom of the glacier that's being flushed out. We call that glacial flour. And I'm going to get to glacial flour in a little bit. But this is what one of these rivers looks like in West Greenland. This is a catchment that we studied quite a lot in the past, myself and colleagues. This is Leverett Glacier in Western Greenland. This is kind of an evolution through a summer. And one of the fascinating things I think about these environments is you think about, if you go there in early May, this is just a trickle. This is just a small stream. You might even not notice it flowing very much. And then by kind of late July, it's this absolute behemoth, huge river. The size, I always think of it being Philadelphia, the size of the Delaware River, basically, just this one catchment. And this is it in kind of midsummer, kind of mid-July, towards the end of July. And then when these surface meltwater rivers reach the ocean, and that's when we see these beautiful sediment plumes enter the ocean. And you can see these sediment plumes from satellites. They can be, tens of kilometers in size. They can reach through fjords, and they can reach into shelf environments in some parts of Greenland. And then there's the other type of glacier. We call these tidewater or marine terminating glaciers. These are glaciers that terminate directly into fjords or the ocean or even into lakes. We assume that the hydrology works quite similarly to the land terminating glaciers. But the big difference here is that meltwater river emerges as a sediment plume at depth, and it's buoyant because it's so fresh and cold. And it usually can be neutrally buoyant at several meters or several tens of meters below the surface of the ocean or fjord. I'm not going to talk about these too much. This is not really my area of expertise. There's better people to talk about this than me, but these are very important as acting as a nutrient pump, pumping up nutrient-rich marine water from depth in fjord environments. I'm going to skip through that actually for now. So one of the things I think is pretty unique about glaciers is that they are the bulldozers of the natural world. They push copious masses of sediment, including pre-existing soils and regolith, and recently crushed bedrock to their margins. That subglacially crushed rock is more chemically weathered and transported, is more readily chemically weathered and transported by things like wind and subglacial meltwater, and high turbid discharge from the glacial margins because of this bulldozer or this sandpaper process that glaciers have, has the potential to change downstream biogeochemical cycles, I think. One of the big things here is that this process and the flushing of subglacial environments by surface meltwater exports that very reactive glacial particles that we call glacial flour to downstream environments. And this is a very quick primer on glacial flour. This is what it looks like if you were to measure particle size. It's mainly in the silt to clay size fraction, depending where you split that silt and clay size fraction up. Some people use different classifications. And it peaks, you get most particles around 5 to 10 microns in size. So that's pretty finely ground rock. And if you filtered that out, as you can see from that image I've got on the bottom right-hand corner, you get a nice cake on your filter as well from the glacial meltwater streams. This also translates, this very fine particle size, also translates to a very high surface area, basically anything up to 100 meters squared per gram of surface area on these particles. And that makes them highly reactive, despite the very cold environment in which they're being flushed from. So this stuff weathers. And at least in contemporary environments, if we look at both low and high estimates of the suspended particulate matter load, so the glacial flour load in megatons per year, this is how much glaciers could supply of that really reactive glacial flour to coastal environments every year. So it's up to 23% of global riverine suspended particulate matter supply could come from this glacial flour export from ice sheets and from glaciers. And that's assumed to be speeding up with the amount of the amount of additional ice melt that we're getting as well. And interestingly, Greenland is one of the only environments on Earth where we're getting these rapidly prograding deltas. So we can see this process of particulate matter generation, export, and deposition in coastal environments actively occurring in Greenland and other Arctic environments. And then if we really think back again to like glacial interglacial cycles, this is some nice work that's been done by Henry Patton, actually, some modeling work, thinking about changes in ice volume and bedrock erosion rates and glacial flour flushing. It could be a very huge amount of glacial flour that you could get emerging from ice sheets during deglaciation events. This is just the Eurasian ice sheet deglaciation, and this has been constrained by the amount of sediment that's been observed in the ocean. So this is not like a pie in the sky thought. This is actually constrained estimates. So we have a maximum of nearly 13,000 megatons per year, commonly 1,000 to 5,000 during glaciations when glaciers are at their highest extent. So this is mainly a deglaciation event process that's occurring. And at the high end, this is equivalent of the modern riverine sediment flux, just from the Eurasian ice sheet, just during these deglaciation events. And that does not include sediment flux from the deglaciating Greenland ice sheet, Patagonian ice sheet, Laurentide ice sheet, Icelandic ice sheet as well. So this could potentially be a very huge amount of reactive material entering the oceans in these kind of hot moment events during deglaciation events. And what was the biogeochemical impact of that? I think that's a huge, huge question in my eyes anyway. Okay, so now on to some data, mainly biased towards the work that I've done and that my collaborators have done. Again, just to remind ourselves, throughout the Arctic, we have these very interesting sediment plumes that occur downstream of glacial meltwater inputs. This is actually not just polar regions. This is also Patagonia there in the bottom right-hand corner. But we have Alaska on the top there. That's the Copper River entering the Gulf of Alaska, and we have Greenland in the bottom left there. And then this is just an assortment of data that I kind of clumped together for a recent review article. The micronutrients on the right, this is all the data that I could find. It doesn't mean it's exhaustive. And this is just for several micronutrients that I chose: iron, manganese, cobalt, zinc, copper, cadmium, and molybdenum. And the bottom figure here, the B panel, That's dissolved concentrations normalized to the riverine mean. And by dissolved, I mean less than 0.45 or 0.22 microns in size. And the top is the absolute concentration. So hopefully you can kind of see that when you move from the macronutrients, which tend to be in quite low concentrations in glacial meltwater rivers, to the micronutrients, we get more similar actually to the riverine average for many of these micronutrients in the dissolved phase, especially elements like iron, cobalt, zinc. Cadmium maybe is the one outlier here, and that tends to be very, very low in glacial meltwaters. Many studies have like non-detects for cadmium, for example, in glacial meltwaters. But other micronutrients tend to be, not too dissimilar from a global riverine average. And then when we pull in to just look at the ice sheets, so Leverett Glacier, that glacier that I showed you the video of, and Mercer subglacial lake, a subglacial lake underneath the Antarctic ice sheet, one of the only subglacial lakes that we've successfully drilled into and sampled cleanly. Again, quite similar concentrations. I've just highlighted iron and manganese here. Quite similar concentrations to the global riverine average. Mercer subglacial lake, so that subglacial lake underneath Antarctica, tends to have higher concentrations than that riverine, that global riverine average as well. Potentially order of magnitude higher when it comes to iron for dissolved iron concentrations anyway. So potential for non-trivial amounts of some of these elements to be entrained in glacial meltwaters and flushed towards coastal environments anyway. Oh, there we go. Iron and manganese, just in case you didn't know. And then, thinking about the reactive flour as well, folks have thought about this glacial flour as a potential source of trace metals to the ocean as well in the last decade or so, including me and collaborators and many others as well, mainly thinking about iron in this glacial flour and how reactive that iron or how bioavailable that iron is in glacial flour. And some nice work that's recently done by Zhu et al., Mark Hotwood's group and Eric Achterberger's group, looking at incubating these glacial flowers, different glacial flowers from icebergs and fjord suspended sediments, and seeing the changes in some of these trace metals over time. And you get an enrichment in all the trace metals, most notably in dissolved manganese and dissolved cobalt compared to background concentrations. And then there's just this raft of work looking at the reactivity of glacial flour when you try and feed it to marine organisms and see how they respond to it, including very recent work, for example, by Benson in iScience, which showed that glacial or indicated that glacial rock flour enhanced phytoplankton growth in phosphorus and trace metal depleted environments. And then some of my own work is try to look at the valence state and relating that to the reactivity of iron in these particles, particularly in nanoparticulate aggregates, and showing that some of these nanoparticulate aggregates in glacial flour can be enriched in iron too. And then there's work from Elizabeth Schonfeld, where she's tried to look at the valence state or the speciation of the iron particles and relate that to the bioavailability of these particles to culturing experiments, and showed that glacial material seems to have a much bigger effect on the growth rate and photosynthetic efficiency of organisms when you add that compared to non-glacial, more weathered material. And Neil Wyatt and his co-authors have also done the same using Southern Ocean incubations as well, and showing that glacial material appears to be highly bioavailable when you add it to iron-starved organisms. And I realize I'm running out of time here a little bit, but we also see this particular material being exported to the shelf. This is work by Amber and Annette, actually, and some synchrotron work by myself looking at the iron valence state. And you see these mixed iron 2, iron 3 valence particles being flushed out onto the shelf from fjords. And you see elevated concentrations of particular iron in some parts of the shelf environment in Greenland. And so we think this is kind of interesting that this reactive material can make it that far onto the shelf, and that potentially quite high concentrations of this reactive material make it onto the shelf as well. And there you go. It's the iron 2, iron 3 valence state for these particles from synchrotron data. And then this brings me back to my opening slide. This is Thwaites Glacier in February 2026, so just a few months ago. This is a sediment plume observed coming from Thwaites Glacier, the main glacial meltwater outlet, or thought to be the main glacial meltwater outlet of Thwaites Glacier. And you can quite clearly see this sediment plume in this Sentinel image, and it extends over 60 kilometers out into the coastal ocean around Thwaites Glacier. You do not normally see this. This is an anomaly, perhaps, but it shows you that some of these environments, particularly in Antarctica, much colder than the Arctic, we don't have these big surface to subglacial meltwater connections, but shows you that subglacial processes, subglacial hydrology could potentially have these hot moment effects on coastal ecosystems. I do not know the impact of this sediment plume on coastal biogeochemistry. I have just found this image that I was referred to by a colleague that shows this sediment plume emerging, and it could be quite a lot of sediment and it could be quite a lot of meltwater that emerged, likely related to something like a subglacial lake drainage event. And I'm going to quickly go for my next two slides because I know I'm now in overtime. But this kind of also pairs nicely, I think, with some work that was recently done by Rhianna Jones, looking again at glacial meltwater particle speciation when it comes to iron, looking at iron 2, iron 3 valence states, and connection with organic carbon as well, showing that you can raft out these iron 2, iron 3 rich particles onto the shelf around the Antarctic Peninsula. And again, you can maintain environmentally quite high particular iron concentrations, tens of kilometers from some of these glacial inputs on the Antarctic Peninsula as well. And that this material could potentially be, highly reactive because it has this high iron 2 content related to it. And just to finally sum up, I also think of these environments not just as like the water. The process of producing all this flour and all this very fine sediment can also have an impact on things like dust emissions and dust aerosols. And I don't think we think about this enough in some of the environments that I work in anyway. John Crusius has done some really nice work on this in the Gulf of Alaska. And here you can see on satellite imagery these very nice dust plumes coming out of these regions that are heavily glaciated when you have very high wind speeds at certain times of the year. And again, this could be a process of getting some of this material out a bit further than some of these meltwater plumes because of all these estuarine processes that we're all familiar with that can bury a lot of the reactive material very close to shore. So it's just something else to think about and something that I don't think we think about enough, particularly in places like Greenland. And with that, I won't go any further, but just to put up all my collaborators over all the years and to thank them for all their inputs, both into this presentation and to my career path so far. And happy to take any questions once Laramie has finished with her talk as well.
All right, thanks, John. Thank you very much. And then we will save the question in the end, so we will have more discussion. And then now I will give the floor to Laramie.
Awesome. Okay. Okay, hopefully you guys can see that.
Yes.
Looks good. Okay, great. Well, thank you very much to Stanley and Zhou for the invitation. I'm really honored to talk about my passion in life, trace metals in the Arctic Ocean and the GeoTraces program. My name is Laramie Jensen. I'm currently an assistant professor at Columbia University and the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory and proud GeoTraces ECS member. Okay, so I'll talk first a little bit about, let me just hide the video panel. I'll talk a little bit first generally about the Arctic Ocean and what we learned through the GeoTraces program. And I really like to show this schematic here on the left-hand side from Carmack et al. 2015, modified slightly. And that really shows how unique the Arctic Ocean is compared to other ocean basins, which is that it's heavily surrounded by land masses, shallow continental shelves, and it's got pretty restricted pathway points of exchange between the Pacific and Atlantic Ocean. But importantly, we do have inflowing warm Atlantic water on one side and much cooler, fresher Pacific water coming in through the opposite side, through the Bering Strait. And then this pathway of river water starting here on the Siberian shelves that advex across the Arctic and exits into the North Atlantic. This is a 3D plot of iron concentrations from the most recent GEOTRACES Intermediate Data Product 2025. And it includes the data from the 2015 GEOTRACES cruises to the Arctic, as well as some of the data from international polar years 2007 and 2011. And what I really wanted to highlight here, you're looking at the concentrations of iron in color, is that GEOTRACES pretty quickly identified a lot of the major sources of elements like trace metals to the Arctic, and some of those being shelf input. So you can see high concentrations here on the shelves. Those are advected offshore. You can see that in the Eastern Arctic here too, in the Barents sector. Point sources of hydrothermal inputs and shelf sources over here in the Canadian sector as well. We were also able to see the influence of those river water pathways incorporated into the transpolar drift current that bisects the central Arctic. And that led to high metal concentrations and other species concentrations in the central Arctic. And we were also able to look a little bit at the Pacific water inflow coming in through the Bering Strait and track its pathway as it leaves the Arctic through the Canadian Arctic archipelago, as well as that inflow of Atlantic water. So kind of touching upon a lot of the major sources and sinks of trace metals within the Arctic Ocean. And I really am going to focus today on the importance of continental shelf sediments and freshwater as major sources of trace metals to the ocean, to the Arctic Ocean specifically, and freshwater, including rivers, ice melt, and incoming Pacific water, but with a definite focus on that riverine water. And what I also want to note too is that a lot of the activity for producing trace metals and kind of controlling the distribution of trace metals happens on these broad, shallow continental shelves here. Once we get into the middle of the basin, which is really well exemplified in this diagram here, physical advection and the mixing between those incoming Atlantic and Pacific derived water masses tends to dominate the distribution of trace metals within the central Arctic. It's a pretty oligotrophic basin in general. We're not seeing the influence of vertical biological cycling, but we are seeing some really nice effects of mixing and lateral inputs from the shelves. Okay, these are important enough that there was a study of multiple GEOTRACES synthesis products. So one that I'll highlight quickly was by Matt Charette et al. In 2020, looking at the transpolar drift current, which again pulls fresh water across the central Arctic. This is a nice plot compiled from the US GEOTRACES and the German GEOTRACES cruises to the central Arctic. You're looking at the percent of meteoric water, so water derived from rivers and precipitation. And you can see that the percent of meteoric water is the highest here within the central Arctic. And we were able to use other tracers to trace that back to the Siberian shelf system, which we know, again, is pulling river-derived and sea ice melt water across the Arctic. And eventually that water does exit into the North Atlantic. We could also see that tracers were heavily correlated to that meteoric water, again, coming from the Siberian shelves. So tracers like DOC, CDOM, some of our favorite trace metals like iron, copper, barium, nickel, et cetera, all had really nice correlations to percent meteoric water, and also short-lived isotopes like radium-228 and thorium-232. So this is not an exhaustive list. Please look at the paper if you want to see if your favorite tracer was well correlated to meteoric water. But just to kind of highlight that a lot of our tracers were incorporated into these waters, and it was a large source of many of these to the central Arctic and really a dominating feature. And again, importantly, that feature can be tracked back out into the North Atlantic, especially through the Fram Strait area, which was also profiled during the 2015 GEOTRACES, 2015-2016 GEOTRACES expeditions. I'll talk a little bit too about shelves and compilations that we've done looking at what's going on the shelves. Each Arctic shelf has a little bit of a different personality, but they were all sources for many trace metals and other isotopes. So this is a section here going from the Alaskan Pacific sector here on the Chukchi Shelf all the way across to the North Pole and then down to the Barents Shelf here. So you can see that transect inset through here. And you're looking at the concentration of iron on the top and manganese on the bottom. What I really want to highlight, right, is that you can see that the shelves were a large source of iron, and particularly within the Western Arctic sector, that signal is ejected quite far offshore and is a strong subsurface signal throughout depth, as well as some lateral inputs of manganese from those shelves as well. So, and then you can also see the influence here near the Central Arctic of that river water that I talked about before. Now, this is looking pan-Arctic across kind of the central basins, but we can also compare between the Western Arctic and the Canadian Arctic Archipelago, which is this area right here, where we also saw high amounts of iron being resuspended in the sediments. However, unlike the Chukchi Shelf, most of that material was crustal or lithogenic derived. So it was coming from passive, non-reductive dissolution of iron. And that's nicely illustrated here by this figure, comparing particulate iron concentrations to particulate aluminum with that crustal ratio identified here in the dotted line. And those circle sizes corresponding to more fraction of non-lithogenic particulate iron. So these red circles here are data taken from the Chukchi Shelf, where we saw a lot of evidence of reductive dissolution of iron and manganese from the sediments, versus the Canadian Arctic Archipelago, these much smaller circles here with black outlines that show that the particulate iron was really nicely correlated to particulate aluminum and did not have a large fraction of non-lithogenic iron. So really strong benthic and lateral inputs of iron and manganese in particular from the shelves, and evidence across the Arctic for different processes, so both reductive and non-reductive dissolution, and that carried out across different size fractions of these elements as well. And for more discussion too about that sort of lateral movement of water, particularly within the Western Arctic, I want to point you to another GEOTRACES synthesis product by myself and Laura Whitmore and many others looking at that subsurface water mass, the cold Arctic halocline, and what tracers are sort of preserved within that as we move away from the shelves. Okay. So that really brings me to change within the Arctic. As John said in his talk, the Arctic and the Antarctic, they're warming much more rapidly than other areas of the ocean. That's particularly true within the Arctic. And this is having a really large effect on the coastal environment in particular. So I really like this little schematic kind of showing the changes are already well underway in the coastal environments, but that we expect to see even more change in the future. So this is just kind of showing, right, that we're getting breakup of sea ice that's affecting habitats of, some of our favorite charismatic megafauna like polar bears and seals. It's having an effect on the people who live on these coastal areas of the Arctic. So unlike maybe the Antarctic, the Arctic is populated by many indigenous populations across Alaska, Canada, Russia, and Europe. So these populations have lived for many hundreds, thousands of years subsisting on the coastal ecosystem, and that is under a massive amount of change right now. And those are changes that are very evident to the people living in that region. They're also experiencing things like increased coastal erosion, that reduction of sea ice leading to much more turbulent wave mixing, more increased ship traffic, more infrastructure being built that's causing harmful emissions. So the coastal Arctic is undergoing these very rapid shifts physically, biologically, and chemically. And this study here highlighted a couple of them and some questions that might come up. How are trace elements and their isotopes increasing or decreasing as a response to this rapid coastal change? And how can we use the parameters that we study to track erosion, permafrost thaw, glacial meltwater, pollution, et cetera, in the Arctic? I think John made a great case for using metals and isotopes to track glacial meltwater, but many of the things that we study through GeoTraces can also be used to track these other processes as well. And really kind of gathering around how will ecosystem shifts affect nutrient availability and demand in the coastal Arctic. So we're seeing these large shifts in phytoplankton community composition, in zooplankton, in fish migration. That's really changing the nutrient demand and different quotas of trace metals within the Arctic. And so now is the time to really focus on this area and study the changes occurring. And I wanted to highlight too that a lot of these are directly related to things like nutrients, particles, organic matter, trace metals, isotopes. This is a ripe area for discovery. And trace elements and their isotopes, again, can help us answer these questions and really assess the biogeochemical impact of a changing landscape on the Arctic ecosystem as a whole. So I'm really pushing like more holistic studies in the Arctic that are combining together physics, biology, and chemistry to get a really broad sense of the ecosystem level change that we're seeing. Okay, so I'm going to talk about some data and projects that I'm involved in two rapidly changing sectors of the Arctic Ocean. On the left-hand side here, this is a map of projected warming potential within the Arctic. And I just wanted to highlight that the two areas I'm going to talk about, the Alaskan Pacific sector here, in between Russia and Alaska, as well as the East Siberian and Laptev seas, are among the most affected by potential warming and increased warming within the Arctic. And they're also underlaid by a lot of permafrost. So permafrost is mobilizing carbon, it's mobilizing metals into the ocean, and it's thawing quite rapidly. So we're seeing this increase in chemical weathering across the Arctic. And that's particularly prevalent in these areas, with lots of studies being done, particularly in Alaska, to look at permafrost thaw and the effect on discharge into the ocean and into the rivers. So these two areas are rapidly changing, and these are nice areas to focus on. Okay, so now again is the time to be collaborating across disciplines. These are questions that are just inherently multidisciplinary. Okay, we should be collaborating with terrestrial scientists. We should be collaborating with physical oceanographers, biological oceanographers. That's how we're going to best be able to monitor and predict this rapid Arctic change. Okay, so I'll talk first about Pacific water inflow and the change going on in that sector of the Arctic. This is a nice satellite-derived chlorophyll map that I like to show that shows the rate of change in biomass over the last 2 decades as derived from satellite chlorophyll. So you'll notice that the big hotspots are here in the Barents Sea sector. Also, we're still looking at a map of the Arctic, but it's flipped around from the other maps. So here's Greenland, here's Alaska, here's Russia. But you can see in the Barents sector in the Eastern Arctic, high rates of change in biomass, a lot more productivity happening on these shallow continental shelves. And that's also true in the Chukchi and Beaufort Sea sectors here in between Alaska and Russia, where we're also seeing this high rate of biomass change. So this paper identified this rate of biomass change, and without measuring actual nutrient inflow to the Arctic, thought that it's possible that this is due to more nutrients entering the Arctic, so an increase in nutrient supply. We already know that this sector is undergoing significant community shifts, particularly in phytoplankton species. The area is becoming a lot more Pacific-like, and we're getting smaller phytoplankton proliferating rather than large Arctic phytoplankton, and that's causing a shift in zooplankton community, in benthic foraging, shifts across the entire ecosystem structure. And physically speaking, that Pacific inflow that's entering through the Bering Strait is warming, freshening, and increasing in volume. Okay, so we're getting more flow through the Bering Strait, and it's becoming warmer and fresher. And that's important because that Pacific inflow is supplying about 1/3 of the nutrients to the Arctic, even though it's a very, very small volume-wise contribution to the overall Arctic. It's responsible for supplying a lot of nutrients to this region. So I've been really interested in these questions in the Pacific sector of the Arctic because we know that trace metals and macronutrients have a large effect on productivity as well as community composition in other areas of the ocean. So I've been wondering, since we have very good physical monitoring on this side, we're noticing these trend changes in temperature and salinity. How might trace metal and nutrient supply be changing over time within this region? And this is definitely something that we thought about from the 2015 GeoTraces perspective. So we really honed in on, how can we quantify the amount of change happening from the Pacific to the Arctic, knowing that that flow is primarily one direction. So water is coming from the Bering Sea and the Pacific sector and flowing northwards through the Bering Strait. These are surface plots of copper, manganese, iron, and zinc, just really within that Pacific Arctic sector, within the Bering Strait region. So the Bering Strait being that narrow strip right between the tips of Alaska and Russia here. And you'll notice that we did sample through there on our way to the North Pole. We also identified this spot right here as a potential Pacific end member because we know that there's upwelling of Bering Sea water onto those shelves, and that water eventually is incorporated into the Bering Strait. So this might be a nice comparison of what's coming in from the Pacific and how we might assess inputs along the way. And if you look at just that point and notice the metal concentrations are in fact increasing as we move northward, it might be easy to say that the Pacific end member is not contributing substantially to the metals that are actually entering the Arctic. There's clearly localized inputs along the way. But I think what we also quickly realized by looking more deeply at the physics in the region is that it's just not as simple as one point. And while this water is certainly eventually making it into the Arctic, the question of different areas of Pacific water that are incorporated into the Bering Strait is a little more complicated. So this is something that I focused on a lot during my postdoctoral work at the University of Washington, and that was revisiting the Bering Strait region and trying to take much higher resolution trace metal samples. So physical oceanographers have been monitoring the Bering Strait since the early 1990s, and they have very well characterized that warming and freshening trend, as well as the advection of different water masses. And they go back year to year to take high resolution sampling across the Bering Strait. So now we've kind of really zoomed in. Here again is that Bering Strait. It's about 85 kilometers across. We can only get into the US sector, which again is about 45 kilometers. But what I really wanted to highlight compared to this previous slide, right, is that we have a lot more resolution. Instead of just 2 points, which were about here and here for geotraces, we now have data across the entire strait and moving northward. And it shows you how much spatial variability is really present within this region that we didn't capture on larger basin scale cruises. So there really isn't one Pacific end member, right? That water mass is not a monolith. There's actually multiple water masses. And there's a large range of trace metal values that we're seeing within that region. So we can begin to put bounds on a value of a Pacific end member to kind of track change moving northward. But again, it's more complicated than just one point. And what I also really want to touch upon here, especially thinking about coastal dynamics, is that the Alaskan coastal water, which, as the name might suggest, is the water mass closest to Alaska, is really high in pretty much all trace metals, particularly copper and nickel, but also manganese, also iron, and sometimes zinc as well. So this Alaskan coastal water, we were not able to capture it on GeoTraces. It's far too shallow for most large ships to get to that area of Alaska, but this was a really large source, high concentrations of trace metals that previously were uncaptured. Lots of expeditions go through the Bering Strait and sample along there, but it's usually kind of in the middle of the flow path rather than getting close to the coast. So this was kind of an previously uncaptured, but certainly important driver of trace metal supply to the Arctic. So we can also capitalize on the fact that we know a lot about the physics of the region to start kind of grouping these trace metals into the different water masses. I've been thinking too, are these metals useful tracers of the water masses? But using those water mass transports, we can also identify fluxes of the metals year to year. So here's just kind of a basic schematic of the Bering Strait showing the three major pathways of water entering the Arctic: Anadyr water, Bering Sea water, and that Alaskan coastal current or Alaskan coastal water that I was talking about before with kind of generalized flow paths. We can take the known transports of each of those water masses and weight the concentrations of trace metals within the water masses by that contribution to the overall transport through the Bering Strait. And I won't belabor that point, but it kind of gives you a weighted average value for each trace metal. And then we can calculate a flux by taking that total strait average and multiplying it by the climatology. And our climatological value might nominally be about 0.9 Sverdrups. That's the sort of total volume transport through the Bering Strait, but that has been increasing. So it's also useful to look at this as a changing value year to year. But just using that climatological value, I've returned to these exact same study sites every year since 2021. My 2025 data is not yet processed, but here's just kind of an idea of manganese flux through the Bering Strait. I'm showing manganese in particular because it had the most statistically significant trend with time, but you can see that that manganese flux is generally increasing year to year with pretty large error values as well. And what will be interesting is to assess which one of these water masses, Anadyr water, Bering Sea water, or the Alaskan coastal water, is the most prone to change and really driving this increase in flux that we're seeing. But these are high fluxes that actually exceed the net exchange that we're seeing on the other side of the Arctic, the amount of metals leaving to the North Atlantic, suggesting that the Arctic is probably a sink for manganese. I'll just briefly show too some of the other elements. I have more data, but here were some of the other statistically significant relationships. So an increase in silicate, increase in nickel flux, zinc flux, et cetera, through the Bering Strait. And happy to talk about that more if people have questions. And it'll be interesting to see how the 2025 data fits into all of this. So an increased flux from the Pacific to the Arctic, and that's again accompanied by this strong warming and freshening signal that we're seeing on the physical side of those Pacific waters entering the strait. And we have year-round data for those physics. So trying to link that together with the biogeochemistry is also a useful and interesting exercise to kind of touch upon seasonality of those fluxes within the Bering Strait as well. Okay, and then the next thing I wanted to talk about was honing in a little bit more on what we can learn about what's going on the Siberian shelves, especially as that is a really important contributor to this large freshwater signal that we see in the central Arctic. So again, waters feeding in from major rivers here are incorporated into the transpolar drift current and pulled across the Arctic. Here's where GeoTraces has been able to sample, and that's also including data from the international polar years. But you can see that there's still a pretty large gap in our knowledge here on the Russian shelves. And that's been a major focus for the Nansen-Amundsen Basin Observing System program, which has been monitoring this area for physical change since 2001 with many mooring locations. And in the past couple of years has also started to integrate chemistry into their studies as well. So much like the Bering Strait program that I was just talking about, the physical oceanographers need to go back out to recover their moorings, and they take high resolution data, CTD data, when they do that to kind of help contextualize and calibrate their sensors. So here's the cruise track from 2025 NABOS program. I flipped it around, but these islands here correspond to these islands here. So we're getting right along the EEZ and right along that kind of continental shelf area. We're looking at the Makarov Basin, the Amundsen Basin, and the Nansen Basin, and getting pretty high resolution data, particularly on the shallow shelves here. And that's a pretty, you can see strong low salinity signals indicating that we're probably getting a lot of river water and evidence of the transpolar drift being pulled from these shelves here. I wanted to highlight some of the really great work that's already been done through the NABOS program by some of my other favorite early career Arctic researchers. This is work done by Lauren Kipp and Laura Whitmore, who've been involved with the NABOS program for a couple of years now. This is a paper by Lauren, a former Arctic geotracer, kind of comparing, again, the data that we received from GeoTraces and from the international polar years in the central Arctic to newer data from the NABOS program, where she's also been able to collect short-lived radium isotopes, which are really nice tracers of continental shelf material due to the kind of residence time or decay time of the radium-228. And I wanted to show this figure, just kind of showing that, you know, in previous years, particularly 2007 and 2011, there was a nice relationship between radium and meteoric water. But now we're seeing this dispersion, this high amount of radium that cannot necessarily be directly correlated to incoming river water, that indicates that we're getting more shelf-derived material being incorporated into the transpolar drift. And again, that transpolar drift is pretty quickly pulled across the central Arctic and eventually leaves out into the North Atlantic. So if we're getting this increase in shelf-derived material, we might expect to also see an increase in some of our other favorite shelf-derived tracers like iron or manganese or some of the other bioactive trace metals. So this is a project that I have funded currently through the National Science Foundation that is capitalizing on the NABOS 2025 program, and it's a chemical, biological, physical collaboration. we're really trying to link together ecosystem and biogeochemical shifts that are brought on by this increased freshwater transport and this ongoing warming of that incoming Atlantic water. So this is yet another map of the Arctic, but you can see the NABO stations underlying here, and then the major circulation pathways, as well as that sort of drainage catchment area within the Siberian sector that's likely affecting a broad swath of the NABO station plan here. So this is really capturing Atlantic water change as it moves along the shelf, as well as that freshwater change in the surface area. And this was a project devised by myself and 3 other early career female researchers, Claire Gaffey, Amelia Chamberlain, and Ali D'Angelo. And we're linking together trace metals with phytoplankton pigment and species identification, markers of primary productivity and DNA sequencing, and microplastics and how that might affect zooplankton diet. So we're getting a pretty broad ecosystem view from what I kind of consider the base of the food web, which are trace metals and nutrients, all the way up to zooplankton speciation, which we are also seeing an abrupt shift in this sector due to ongoing warming and increase of volume of Atlantic water. So this data has been collected and the processing is underway, so stay tuned for that. But I wanted to highlight this as one of the nice initiatives that I think we should be following up on within the Arctic, which is capitalizing on a lot of these long-term observational programs that go up year to year that might not be directly set up to do trace element work, but that we can kind of do modifications and try and spin up more programs to get out there to do more interdisciplinary work. Okay, and I'll just leave you with a few broad conclusions here. So GeoTraces greatly expanded our view of the Arctic Ocean. It was an incredibly undersampled ocean basin for trace elements and their isotopes. To me, it really reinforced the importance of continental shelf sediments and river water input in controlling the distribution of the trace metals that I study. The coastal Arctic is highly susceptible to climate change and warming. We did not take high-resolution coastal transects along geotraces, but this is where we're going to see the largest effects from glacial meltwater, from permafrost thaw, from coastal erosion, river discharge, phytoplankton, and productivity composition. So now is the time, again, to really build those international and interdisciplinary collaborations within the Arctic to best target those processes. And 2 of the projects that I'm currently working on, the Bering Strait, we have this really nice multi-year time series showing an increasing flux of many macronutrients and metals from the Pacific to the Arctic. That's particularly true for manganese and iron, which again exceed the net exchange to the Atlantic, so suggesting the Arctic continues to be a sink for manganese and iron. And then on the Siberian shelves, we have this increased freshwater leading to higher stratification, perhaps this increase in continental shelf material that Lauren Kipp looked at, and the ongoing effects of Atlantification, which are going to have a profound effect on physical feedbacks and ecosystem dynamics. So thank you so much for listening and happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Laramie. It's a really nice overview in the Arctic Ocean. If you have questions, please raise your hand or just type in the chat. Please go ahead. Okay, there was a wave of clapping, so I couldn't see the hand. We do have one question from the chat. I think this one is from John. For John, it's from Jim Sutton. So I have to read out the question because otherwise I
can read it out to you.
Oh yeah, sure.
Well.
Please go ahead.
No problem. Yeah, thanks to both of you for the great talks. Really, really enjoyable. My question was for John, but then afterwards, it was partially answered by Laramie. So I'm just curious as to how much in detail people have looked at the influence of permafrost melt on concentration variability, whether it be in the ocean or in the riverine or estuarine sectors. How much work has been done on it? So John, if I can ask you to answer that first.
Yeah, thanks, Joe, for your question. I think the short answer is yes, there are folks looking at this, and the one that comes off the top of my head that came out recently is Brett Poulin at UC Davis has done some work on rusting rivers in Alaska and seeing or observing the effects of permafrost melt on trace element enrichment in permafrost streams in Alaska. And I think that probably translates, as Laramie kind of suggested, translates to fluxes to the ocean as well.
So it is principally localized to Alaska and not to the Canadian Arctic or Russian. Well, Russia's a bit difficult to.
I think there are also some folks looking at the Mackenzie River and trying to relate permafrost degradation to change in fluxes in that river system as well. To my knowledge, I don't know too many folks working in Siberia at the moment because the politics are complicated, obviously. I know there is some trace element data knocking around from some of those systems in the Arctic, in the Russian Arctic. Not always super easy to get hold of or to find, actually. Laramie might know better than myself, though. And there is some older data looking at kind of estuarine processes in the Russian Arctic as well, as you probably know, Jill. But Laramie might be a better place to comment on that.
Thank you for your answer. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll echo what John said. I think that the majority of work that I know being done is mostly in Alaska, especially as they're seeing the infrastructure and erosion issues caused by ongoing permafrost thaw in those regions. So it's a very timely question there. And the underlying bedrock lithology in Alaska is very sulfidic, and it's leading to increased acid rock drainage that's helping to keep metals like iron in solution, leading to those rusting river questions. But yes, there are a lot of people looking especially at iron, not a lot at the other heavy metals that we might see mobilized from permafrost. So I think that's still a pretty rich area that I'm hoping to explore here with collaborators. And certainly the progress of those rivers and how metal concentrations might be changing on their way to the ocean, I think is also underexplored. But localized effects are definitely very prevalent in Alaska, especially to fish and other biology living.
Also, I'm from the Yukon, so right next to Alaska, and we've got the same thing going on, but it influences the Alaskan sector with the Yukon River passing into Alaska. So great, fantastic work.
All right, we have another question from Lauren. Please.
Hey guys, great talks from both of you. Thank you. My question's for Laramie about your Bering Strait flux calculation. So you have the 3 pathways, but you don't have data from the Anandir pathway. So I was just wondering, did you extrapolate the data from the middle of the strait to get the trace metal concentrations, or did you use the ACC concentrations? And the second half of that question is whether you think the ACC concentrations are high because of the river influence or because of proximity to the shelf, which maybe influence your decision of how you determine the Anandir end member.
Yeah, that's such a great question. Yeah, I think that schematic that I showed of the general pathways, right? The Anandir water is primarily flowing through the Russian side of the strait. But the interesting thing about the Bering Strait is that the physics is changing rapidly, on a daily time scale, the sort of placement of water masses. And you get these really strong winds coming from the north, pushing against the northward flow of the water. And it causes this displacement of the Anandir water into the eastern side of the strait. And we do actually capture that year to year. The Anandir water does flow into the US sector of the strait. It's primarily a bottom water current, but I do actually have data from the Anandir water. It's very noticeable in temperature, salinity, and nitrate space because it's a very nutrient-rich water mass. So I do have data from the Anandir water, a lot less than I have from the Bering Sea water and the Alaskan coastal water, but I use that in my calculations primarily rather than trying to do any extrapolation. Okay. And then in terms of the Alaskan coastal water, I think it's primarily river water. As we've talked about too with other projects, that water, where it's originating from is kind of up for debate, is a lot about Yukon River discharge. There's thoughts that it's even water all the way from the Gulf of Alaska that's incorporated along the Alaskan current that flows up through the Unimak Pass and reaches all the way up into the Bering Strait. It's very nutrient poor, but very trace metal rich. So I certainly wouldn't discount inputs from shelf sediments as well as influencing that, but noticeably high concentrations, particularly for copper and for iron, which to me suggests, drainage from river sources, particularly with the copper mining that has been ongoing in Alaska.
So is the Anadyr water that you've sampled more similar to like the central part of the strait, like the concentrations in the central part of the strait, as opposed to the
There's a lot of variability. I mean, the first year that I went out in 2021, the Anadyr water had the lowest trace metal concentrations. It was very high for silicate, nitrate, and phosphate. And that's sort of like the expected kind of contribution from that side. That's sort of what people think of as the main transport of nutrients into the Arctic is from the Anadyr water, but it's very low for trace metals. Year to year, though, that signal has been increasing. So, those waters are formed more in the Gulf of Anadyr, around Alaska. There's upwelling from the shelves. There's river water. There's shelf sediment sources. So there's been some really nice work from Japanese and Korean scientists looking at that. But we can't get into that sector directly.
Cool. Thanks.
Yeah.
We also have a question from Ariana. Please go ahead.
Hi, I have a question for Laramie. I wonder how much data you have, because now you've gone quite a few times, and I wonder whether this, like the amount of data that you've collected, can start being used or being incorporated into models to try and understand whether or inform where you can go sampling next to prove some of your hypotheses, and if you're exploring this space either from extended optimal multi-parameter analysis or transpose matrices or mapping, anything of the like. So connecting more to what we talked about in the previous seminar.
Yeah, that's such a great question. I've done a little bit of OMPA work, especially some of the trace metals are so sequestered within those water masses that I've been using things like copper and nickel, especially, which are just really, really high in that Alaskan coastal water, to perhaps trace those water masses going farther northward. These are well studied physically, and they do disperse and kind of follow bathymetry once you move farther north. The issue is having also kind of a dearth of sampling farther north to sort of connect to and kind of ground in those models. But this is work that I definitely am interested in and would want to do because, now I have quite a bit of data year to year. So I've been thinking really, really concretely about the Bering Strait, but I do have data moving farther northward, and it would be really interesting to talk more about trying to model some of that or incorporate it into the flow models that people have through that region.
Yeah, awesome.
Yeah.
Can I ask another question to John?
Yes, please.
It's more a curiosity, but why does cadmium behave so differently in glacial meltwater than all the other trace metals that you presented?
Good question, Ariana. Thank you. I don't know. I think there might be some sampling. I mean, there aren't many samples to begin with, first of all. And I think there might be some sampling bias to maybe lithologies that just don't have much cadmium in to begin with. I mean, phosphate concentrations tend to be fairly low. Dissolved phosphate, dissolved inorganic phosphorus concentrations tend to be fairly low in glacial meltwaters compared to other environments. So I think that's why there's very little data on particulate cadmium in these meltwater rivers. So that would also, I think, help inform whether the cadmium is mobilized from the particles or not, or whether the particles are kind of naturally enriched in cadmium. But yeah, I think there might be some sampling bias, and I think there might just be very low cadmium concentrations in the rock that's being eroded as well in the samples that we have anyway.
Okay, thank you.
All right, I think there's another question from the chat. I will read it out loud so the recording can record it. This is a question for John, two questions for John. The first one is, you mentioned to investigate iron reactivity in nanoparticulate aggregates in different regions. Could you please explain this in detail? And the second question is how to sample the subglacial meltwater. Did you drill a hole from the surface to take samples, but how to monitor where to drill the hole?
Okay, so the first one on iron reactivity in nanoparticulate aggregates. This is really like inferred reactivity, I guess, and that we're looking at iron nanoparticulate aggregates using electron microscopy. And we're looking at the valent state of those aggregates using eels. And we're also using synchrotron-based techniques, the microscopy synchrotron-based techniques to look at these aggregates and the valent state in these aggregates. And this is stick some data, so iron L-edge data at high resolution. So we can get to about 30 nanometer per pixel resolution using that. And TEM, you can get slightly finer resolution to look at these aggregated particles. So that's how we're looking at the kind of inferred reactivity of these nanoparticulate aggregates. And then how to sample subglacial meltwater. Yeah, this is very, very difficult. And this is why we only have data from 2 subglacial lakes in Antarctica. And these are fairly shallow subglacial lakes as well. These are under 1,000 meters of ice or less. Whillans Subglacial Lake and Mercer Subglacial Lake are the 2 lakes that we have samples from. And this is not me who's doing the drilling. These are like very experienced drillers. I have just been associated with one of these projects, so I was not doing the drilling myself, and I actually wasn't on the field work for that. I just received the samples and analyzed the samples. So this is hot water drilling that they do, and it's designed to minimize contamination from a microbiological perspective. So all the water that goes into the hole is like UV treated and filtered to several different pore sizes before it goes in the hole. So it's very tough and it takes a long time to do it. There have been other attempts to drill these hot water holes through the ice sheet into subglacial lakes that have failed. And there have been other attempts to drill hot water holes through other parts of Antarctica, not into subglacial lakes, but into sub-ice shelf cavities and ground inline zones that have been successful using this kind of technique as well. So it's been used a few different times, but it takes a lot of person power, takes a lot of time, takes a lot of logistics. It's very, very complicated, and that's why, and you're in Antarctica as well, which makes things 10 times as hard. And that's why it hasn't been attempted too many times, and that's why it's always a little bit of risk associated with those kinds of projects. Oh, I don't think we can hear you unless it's just me.
Hi, Manu. Yeah, I think you didn't mute yourself, but your speaker probably has some setting issue.
I guess I didn't really answer the latter part, how to monitor where to drill the hole. That is far beyond my narrow expertise. I do not know how they decide where to drill the hole, apart from geophysical surveys to make sure they're hitting a point inside the lake. And I think it's always a little bit of a exciting moment when they hit the bottom of the hole into the lake to make sure they actually hit the lake. So, but yeah, there are people far more qualified than myself deciding where to actually drill. And it is amazing actually, because some of these lakes are not like that big, particularly Mercer and Whillans. They're not that big. So drilling through that amount of ice accurately to then hit the lake is just an amazing feat of engineering and science.
I also have one question for John, if I may. So I read your Nature paper about these iron nanoparticles, and then I was wondering if you can comment on the longevity of these reactive iron. Like, can they really survive oxidation in the ocean, or can they? How far would you think they can be transported from coastal to the open ocean?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I'm going to throw it over to you oceanographers to tell me the answer to that. But I mean, we have a little bit of data going through fjords, less really characterizing the nanoparticles as they pass through the fjords. To be honest, like I have some data that I briefly showed looking at using synchrotron techniques again to look at the valence state of some of these particles as they go through the fjord onto the shelf. And Rhiannon Jones's paper from the Antarctic Peninsula is also using a similar technique to show the passage of some of these particles as they go over the shelf in the Antarctic Peninsula as well. So, and the valence state generally doesn't change that much over the passage from glacier to shelf, which suggests to me that it's the same kinds of particles that are surviving aggregation and deposition. And certainly, most of it is deposited, obviously, in the low salinity zone or in the fjord or in the near coastal environment. But it suggests to me as well that some of these particles are making it out onto the shelf at least. Further than that, I really don't know, and it's over to you guys. And there is some changes that happen over that gradient, like what Rihanna showed us. There could be some protection by organic matter, for example, and then biology really kicks in those kind of inner fjord areas and outer fjord areas that could change the composition, or at least how these particles are rafted out. But yeah, I think we need more work to be done to figure that out. That's a good question.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think we are almost finished, and then I want to thank you too, and thank you all for joining the seminar. And I also want to remind you that we have another seminar coming next month. So please feel free to join. And thanks, John and Laramie, again for joining us.
Thanks.
See you next month.
Thanks for having us. Yeah.
Thank you, Laramie. Thank you, John. Bye.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you, everyone.
Stanley, see you next month.
See you next month.
And thank you. Bye.